It's in the Blood, Episode 1. Greetings, dearly beloved. This is Jesse Cooper, an American nomad, and I've lived a life of adventure. I use the appellation nomad because I've lived at 73 different addresses on 3 continents. I've visited hundreds of places on 5 continents. I've traveled around the world, and I've lived a life that's not anything like yours. Jesse Cooper is a nom de plume, an alias. The root of the word capital is the Latin caput, meaning head. Thus, a capital crime is one that you can lose your head for. There's no statute of limitations on capital crimes. I've committed 60 of them, involving powerful organizations. These organizations hold grudges. I will tell you bounty hunting stories, more grudge holders. Today, I still need to offer this option on my voicemail. If you wish to leave a death threat, please press 3. I will be vague on places and names because I have not asked permission from my associates to tell these stories. The only people I will name are dead. If you like stories of adventure, true crime, martial arts, travel, and history, then Hearts Precious, listen, and I will tell you the true tale of my life and times. When I enlisted in the Army at 17, I was thrilled. I would be a heavily armed teenager with state-of-the-art bang-bangs in a war zone. I couldn't see the downside. By 1967, the war had been raging for a number of years. If this was before your time, I can tell you the country was deeply divided over the war. One side said we had to stop another domino from falling to the communists, and the democratic government of South Vietnam had asked for our help. They said, America, love it or leave it, and draft dodgers ought to be shot for desertion. The other side saw no national security interest or any just cause to go to war with people halfway around the globe. Why would we go somewhere the French just got tossed out of a few years previously? Every day, the American body count was on the nightly news. Washington would see millions of people protesting throughout the war. There was even a popular anti-war genre of music. Boys signed up with a selective service in high school. The draft worked like this. 365 numbers were issued, one for each day of the year. I don't recall what day the draft started on annually, but for example, if you had number 1, you would be drafted on January 1st. If you had number 2, the 2nd of January, and so forth throughout the year. People with a higher number had a good chance of not being called because the quota for the services would be filled before their number came up. Guys would brag about having a high number. People with low numbers fled to Canada by the tens of thousands. The sentiment against the war was very strong. Returning soldiers were called baby killers, spat upon, and maligned. They shed their uniforms almost immediately. In some cases, the Army had them change into civilian clothes on the way back to the States. I had enlisted, volunteered for the Airborne Infantry. Even at 17, I knew I was swimming against the current. I had no desire to kill anyone. It was just the adventure I craved. I figured it must be in the blood. By that I mean our genes dictate our physical characteristics, our psyche. Everything about us comes from those who have gone before. The traits that we carry from our ancestors cannot be underestimated. Where else do you come from? Aside from mutations, that's about it. My handwriting is just like my father's. My brother's handwriting is like his mother's. My personality traits are what have enabled me to live the life I have. I never had a use for fear. Fear leads to panic. You never heard anyone say, things were going to hell until I panicked. I haven't discovered the details of my personality from meditating in a cave for years, grasshopper. I relied on modern technology, and I can't gainsay the results. I have an insatiable curiosity coupled with a great memory. I'm compassionate, extroverted, and assertive. I'm wildly enthusiastic, which makes my confidence border on hubris. I'm unflappable, and nothing gets me down. I confront authority. I am not obedient. Nor am I adverse to risk, and I have no neuroses. Sounds about right to me. I learned about my blood when, in 1955, my grandfather received a copy of our genealogy. This tome was 900 pages long and contained 10 generations of our family in America. Considering that this was 50 years before Ancestry.com, it was a real gift. I love the stories it contained and how it traced American history through hundreds of years. My father's side of the family came to America in 1630. They settled in Salem, Massachusetts, 50 years before the witch trials. They continued to populate the Northeast, making a life in the wilderness. 13 men of the family marched in relief of Fort William Henry during the French and Indian War. 220 men of the family fought the British during the Revolution. Their stories are replete with courage and sacrifice. One of them was a member of Washington's Life Guard. The general personally awarded him his sergeant's stripes. Some were captured and starved to death in British prisons. Some had their property and livestock seized and their houses burned. One daughter of the Revolution, Deborah, was in charge of her husband's British prisoners. He had captured a Continental lieutenant who had deserted to the British. A mob of Whigs, who were much incensed by the lieutenant's desertion, came to the house, took the prisoner, and hanged him from a tree in the yard. Upon hearing this, Deborah fearlessly confronted the mob. Her courage, firmness, and personal presence overawed the crowd, and the prisoner was cut down and returned to her. He recovered from his ordeal, but was later court-martialed and hung as a traitor. Strong women in America are nothing new. My direct ancestors, Oliver and his son Moses, were Minutemen in Danbury, Connecticut. The family fielded officers and men in the War of 1812. My cousin Eugene died in the Civil War fighting for the Union. My great-grandfather had 4 sons. All served in the First World War. Grandfather and Uncle Will were aviators and flew in the de Havilland biplanes. I knew Snoopy flew a Sopwith Camel, but I didn't know what country did. I asked my grandfather who flew the Sopwith Camel. He replied, idiots mostly. Don't you remember that song? Mother, hang up your golden star, your son's in a sop today. I replied, no, Grandpa, I think that was before my time. Grandpa left for France on a troop ship in 1918. He told me about how many of his shipmates died of the Spanish flu and were thrown overboard because they didn't have a place to keep the dead. The life expectancy for new pilots in France in the First World War was 2 weeks. I asked him if he ever actually flew combat in France. He replied, no. Kaiser Bill had heard that he had come and decided to call the whole thing off. I don't recall reading that in any history book, but I don't think my grandpa would lie to me. My father flew in B-29 Martin Marauders over Germany in the Second World War. He was the armorer and tail gunner. He operated Quad 50 machine guns, and he was the best shot I ever knew. The B-29 was a twin-engine bomber. It had many unflattering nicknames like the B-Crash, the Widowmaker, Martin Murderer, and the Flying Prostitute, because it was so fast but had no visible means of support. Not the airman's favorite. Originally, my father was to fly 25 missions. He wound up flying 65. He said sometimes the flak was so thick you could walk on it. One morning in England, they took off in a plane called Wabbit Tracks for a bombing run over to Germany. They had a full bomb load, and after climbing high enough to retract the landing gear, the starboard engine went out. The plane went into a steep bank as Buzz, the pilot, tried to circle back to the runway. They dropped so low, 2-story buildings hid them from view from people on the ground. Buzz came in for a belly landing. He was unable to drop the landing gear because it would cause the airplane to stall. They hit the runway. There was a torrent of sparks and a tremendous screeching sound as the runway dissolved the fuselage. My father said it was like riding a giant sparkler, and he prayed that the 2.5-ton bomb load wouldn't ignite. On my mother's side, great-grandfather Herman and his brother came through Ellis Island in the 1980s. They hailed from the Kingdom of Galicia, which was part of the Habsburg Empire, also known as Austrian Poland. Grandpa Herman was a typical American story. He came to America with $19 in his pocket and no English. He settled in Queens, New York, 22 miles from Ellis Island. He made his living as a peddler, a tinker. He went door to door with his backpack, selling needle and thread, mending pots and pans, and sharpening scissors and knives. After a time, he was able to buy a house and send for his beloved Anna, who was still in the old country. They lived upstairs, and his shop was downstairs. They had a single son who was a Marine in the Pacific. He, in turn, fathered my mother. Great-grandfather Herman invested in real estate, and by the time he was 40, he retired with $250,000 in the bank. That's my blood. There were no slackers or cowards among them, and they set a high bar. I know my family history is not unique, and that many of you have a similar heritage, made up of men and women who loved the country they built and fought to keep. My parents met while they attended Cornell University. My father had just gotten out of the service. My mother was a couple of years ahead of him. She would graduate with a degree in journalism. She said she was the only girl in the class, and admitted that in those days, girls went to college to find a husband. When she saw my father, a handsome hunk in a bomber jacket, it was a done deal. It didn't end well. Apparently, the only reason they got married was that she was pregnant with my sister. At that time, abortions were not an option. If they had been, knowing my mom, it would have been a flip of a coin, if she would have had us or not. At the altar, my father told her that he looked forward to the marriage like he looked forward to flying through flak in Germany. My sister was born and I followed 2 years later. I guess times have changed. I was present for the birth of all 3 of my children. When my mother was ready to deliver both my sister and me, my father put her in a cab and wished her good luck. All right, maybe it's not the times. Maybe it was just my dad. 4 years after I was born, she left. He laid hands on her, and she wasn't going to give him a chance to do it again. At that point, my sister and I moved to our grandparents' farm, while my father finished his studies at Cornell. He had left school and went to work when my mother got pregnant with my sister. The farm was a wonderful piece of property. It was 300 acres, bordered on the north and east by roads, the south by a railroad track, and the west by a river. It consisted of 150 acres of fruit: apples, peaches, cherries, plums, pears, and grapes. We had a vegetable and flower garden. There was about 60 acres of field, and the rest was woodlot. My great-grandfather worked as a sharecropper for a wealthy landowner right across the river. In 1870, when this existing orchard came up for sale, he bought it. He married and had 4 sons and a daughter. All the sons graduated from Cornell. My grandfather, the second eldest son, graduated high school from a one-room schoolhouse at the age of 16. His high school education outclassed any college degree that you would find today. He received a classical education. He studied the Greeks, the most famous philosophers of Western civilization, in Latin. He learned German as well as advanced calculus. He had to wait for his brother to graduate Cornell before he could attend. Today, about 40% of the U.S. population gets a degree. In my grandfather's day, only 1.5 did. I asked him what it was like to go to Cornell. He said it was a real privilege. I wonder if today's college students think the same thing. He stayed on the farm and helped the governor, as his father was called, but not to his face. When his time came, he earned a master's degree in animal husbandry. He was asked to stay on and became a professor. He married, and he and his wife lived near the campus. When we entered the First World War, he volunteered for a squadron of aviators assembled from Cornell. He trained as a bombardier in Texas. There he survived a crash that killed his pilot. At the end of the war, his father asked him to come and take over the farm. It was a very hard choice for him to make, whether to resume his life as an academic or go back to being a simple farmer. My grandmother had really enjoyed life at Cornell, and I don't think she ever really wanted to be a farmer's wife. My grandfather was the best man I've ever known. My grandmother may have been a witch. At least that's what I thought when she would clip my toenails after Saturday bath. She was Victorian to the bone, dour and strict, her emotions always kept in check. Warm and fuzzy, never entered into it. Even though my father wasn't present and my mother was gone, my sister and I had a great time growing up there. My grandfather had coops full of chicken and about a dozen Holstein cows. Early in the morning, he would milk the cows and bring a bucket of fresh milk down the hill that my grandmother strained through a cheesecloth and then separated the cream for breakfast. I really missed the taste of raw milk. On Sunday, we got to sleep in till 6. Then after breakfast, my grandfather and I would walk up the hill to the chicken coop. We would select a bird, cut off its head, and bring it back down to the house where grandmother had a pail of boiling water that she dipped the bird in. Pluck its feathers, gut it, and put it in the pot to boil for Sunday dinner after church. After 3 years, my father graduated Cornell with a Bachelor's of Science in Biology. In those days, single parenting wasn't a thing, unless you were widowed. Actually, for my father, parenting wasn't a thing. He married a divorced woman who had 2 girls. We left the farm and settled near the capital of the state. He got a job as a high school biology teacher. It was a hard transition for everybody. My stepmother was overwhelmed, and there was a lot of tension in the house. At this point, my sister and I hadn't seen my mother for about 4 years. Her parents had retired, left New York, and moved to Florida. A deal was struck between my grandparents and my father. My sister and I would come right after school and visit my mother with the proviso that under no circumstances would we leave with her. My mother came from Louisiana to Florida to see us. We stayed with her parents for a couple of days, and then we drove to her apartment on Royal Street in the French Quarter of New Orleans. After she left us, she worked in advertising in New York City. Being bored with that, she wound up in Mexico, where she learned to speak the language well enough to get a job dubbing Spanish in the latest Hollywood movies that were playing south of the border. Eventually, the Mexican government caught her, and because she had no work papers, they expelled her from the country. How odd. Can you believe a country would do that? She had enough money for a bus ticket to New Orleans. She met and soon married a man who was a heavy drinking reporter for the Times-Picayune, the big paper in the Big Easy. When our visit was coming to an end, she asked us if either of us would like to stay with her. I said yes, my sister said no. When my father picked my sister up from the airport, she delivered a note telling him where I was. Living in New Orleans was an amazing experience for a 9-year-old latchkey kid. My new stepfather knew everybody in town. We would walk over to Bourbon Street, and I would sit at a table in the back of the clubs with a Shirley Temple while he drank at the bar. I'd listen to Dixieland jazz and the greats like Al Hirt and Pete Fountain. We'd walk down the street past the strip joints, and at the Showmore Club, the barkers outside the entrance would yell, come on in, y'all. Miss Blaze Star's inside. No curb service tonight, come on in." We frequented the old Absinthe House, Victor's, and so many other places in the quarter. The food was fantastic. We ate at all the great restaurants, Brenner's, the Quarter Two Sisters, and we could always get a table at the Four Seasons. For years, my grandmother had fed me nutritious, wholesome, bland, Presbyterian food. You'd never find a head of garlic in her kitchen. Now I was exposed to crayfish, oysters, jambalaya, and gumbo. My mother was working for a company called MPA. It stood for Motion Picture Advertising. They produced commercials that would run before the movies at the theater. Whenever they needed a boy about my age, I got out of school and would go do a commercial. I made about a dozen of them, but I never got a SAG card. It was the beginning of July, and my mother asked me if I wanted to go to a YMCA camp. I'd always loved the country around the farm, and I thought it'd be fun, so I said sure. Camp Sing Waters was northwest of New Orleans on the Tickfaw River near Holden, Louisiana. Folks took me up on Saturday, dropped me off. It was a great place. It offered boating, horseback riding, swimming, archery. There was a rifle range and a crafts building and a canteen. There was a spring-fed pond with a small dock. The dock was there to give you access to the drinking fountain. It was natural artesian water that came up to a pipe that joined a horizontal pipe with a bunch of holes in it, and the water would shoot out of there, and that was our fountain. The water was cold. About a dozen of us would share a cabin with a counselor. The first night, about 70, 80 kids filled the mess hall. We were asked to stand up and introduce ourselves and say a little something. When my turn came, I asked if I could tell a joke. I heard this joke from my uncle, my father's brother. I didn't understand it, but it was the only joke I knew. I got permission, and I said there were 4 bears, a mama bear, 2 little girl bears, and a little boy bear. One day, one of the little girl bears asked his mother, "Someday will I have a cubby?" And Mama Bear says, "Yes." The other little girl bear asks the mother, "Someday can I have a cubby?" And the mother bear says, "Yes." Then the little boy bear asks his mother, "Someday can I have a cubby too?" The mother bear says, "No." The little boy bear says, "Why?" And the mother bear says, "Because you don't have any cubby hole." The counselors roared, but most of the campers were as clueless as I was. For the next 2 years at Camp Singing Waters, my name was Cubby. I learned to swim at camp, and I became the most improved archer. We did an overnight horseback trip. We took overnight boat trips down the Tickfaw River. On one trip, a water moccasin dropped into the boat from an overhanging branch. Panic ensued, but at the end of the day, everybody was safe. Water moccasins and cottonmouths were omnipresent. The counselors killed them daily. We would skin them, prep the hides for belts at crafts. It was Indian night. We used our towels and belts to make loincloths. We were given war paint and mohawk hair pieces to tie on our heads. I was the best archer in camp, so they put me up a nearby tree with a bow, a broadhead arrow wrapped with a piece of gasoline-soaked rag, and a Zippo lighter. When the counselor who was in charge asked the Great Spirit for his blessing on our war dance, I was to shoot the flaming arrow and ignite the gasoline-soaked campfire. Today, I think they were out of their minds. The target was surrounded by campers. I had a decent elevation, but it was still a tight window. They gave me a broadhead because they were afraid a target point might bounce off the wood. They need the broadhead to stick so the fire would ignite. You can kill an elephant with a broadhead. I got into position, lit the arrow, knocked it, drew it. The flaming end was distracting. I took a breath, let it out, released it, bullseye. The woof from the igniting gas drove the campers back from the fire. Drums pounded and the war dance commenced. I reckon it was a great shot for a 10-year-old. In the 2 years I went to camp, I won the Ragger Award, which was a bandana with a YMCA symbol on it. The first year I got a blue one, the next year I got a red one. There were only a few given out each year during a candlelit ceremony on the night that they were awarded. They were given for good moral conduct, good behavior, good habits. It was sort of like the Boy Scout oath, thrifty, cheerful, reverend. Since that time, I have never been accused of having any of those traits. I must have left them at camp. At the end of my 6 weeks, my mother came to fetch me and I went back to New Orleans. Living on Royal Street was great. We were at the heart of the quarter, and there was then, as there is now, tourists everywhere, and they were from everywhere. My mother bought me a shoe shine box with a footrest on top. She showed me how to shine shoes and told me I could go make money on the street. I wrote 5 cents a shine on the box and went out the door. I had a few regulars, but most of my trade were tourists. They'd usually give me a quarter, sometimes even a half a dollar. Since the movie cost me a dime for a Saturday double feature, I was flush with cash. Our building was just like you might think if you picture the French Quarter. 3 stories tall, white, black cast iron balcony rails, Inside the apartments were built around a square courtyard. During Mardi Gras, all the courtyard doors from the street would be open, and you could walk into any courtyard. There would be food and drink, and a good time was had by all. The Mardi Gras parades that went down Royal Street were the most fun. We lived on the second story. From the balcony, we looked down on the people on the huge floats. We would scream, "Throw me something, mister! Throw me something!" And they would, and we were so pleased with ourselves that we weren't, down below with the press of the crowd fighting for worthless trinkets. The party was so big during Mardi Gras that empty beer cans lined the street. Not lined, filled the streets. I remember a tanker truck. It was a milk truck they'd filled with beer from the Jack's Brewery. They handed out cardboard milkshake cups. I don't know how big they were, 16 ounces, maybe bigger. I stood in line behind the truck and got my cup filled. They didn't care that I was 10. I learned to drink green chartreuse and do the twist, but it wasn't all fun and games. I had questions from my mother, like, what are pasties? What does whites only mean? Who are the colored, and why are they going around the back? Why does everybody call me boy? My name's Jesse. And why do the black guys hold their hats in their hands and call me sir? I was a Yankee in the land of Jim Crow. Obviously, the farm was a rural setting. There were some big farms that hired indigent workers. One year, there was a little black boy that came to school. I had never seen a little black boy before. We made friends, and he came over to the farm, and we'd played a time or two. The next school year, his father, family, had moved on to pick something else somewhere else, so he was gone, and that was the only black kid I ever knew in my life. At that time, the nation was struggling with equality, not equity. The country was divided on the subject of segregation. The law of the land said schools were separate but equal. But there's no such thing. President Eisenhower had to send the 101st Airborne to Little Rock, Arkansas, to force the Democratic governor of the state, George Wallace, to allow black kids into white schools. We moved through French Quarter to Elm Street. The first day there, I spotted some kids down the street, a couple of black brothers about my size. I went down there and we started to play, wrestle, just fooling around. We're kids. Their mom came up and said, I shouldn't be there. I was confused. I didn't know what to think. So we stopped playing and I started walking back toward my house. 4 white boys had been watching me. I walked up toward them. When I got close, they called me a nigger lover and beat me up. I wasn't severely damaged. It hurt, black eye, fat lip, stuff like that. I wasn't on the verge of death. But my mom really couldn't explain it to me. We moved again to Warrington Drive. If you walked out my door, about a block down to the left was a circle. There was a single road that went off to the right of that circle named Sumter. White kids from Warrington would gather at the cul-de-sac, which delineated our white neighborhood from their black neighborhood. They would yell awful things at the black kids. The black kids would shout insults back. I never went down there, so I don't know how close they got to each other. I'm not aware of any fighting. On the first day of school, I rode my bike. If I took Sumter, I'd save about 6 blocks of travel. I turned down Sumter. A block down, a line of black kids were starting to get on the school bus. As I rode by, they just kind of swarmed me, knocked me off my bike, kicked me. It couldn't have been that bad because I was able to escape. Maybe an adult intervened, I don't recall. I picked up my bike, I got on it, and never went that way again. We moved again. I met a friend named Peter. He invited me home one day. His father was there. His dad started talking to me about how the black people were so different. I may just be a slow learner, but I said, like how? He said, well, look at their lips. Look at their hair. Look how black they are. They're more like animals. They're different. I'm saying, I think they're just people, right? He's having none of it. I could see Peter was very uncomfortable. I'd heard about the Klan, but I was determined not to see his point because he didn't have one. I do remember going to school one day in the fall. I can't remember which school it was because when I was in New Orleans, I went to 4 of them. But it was a zoo. There were cops everywhere. A big crowd of white people holding states' rights signs surrounded the school on the outside of the fence. They were chanting, 2468, we don't want to integrate. 8642, we don't want no jigaboo. It was loud. Then I saw a couple of kids walking, black kids walking to the entrance of the school, bracketed by 4 or 5 white men in suits. I didn't see any other white kids, but I followed in behind them through the doorway because it was time for school. The stepfather was on his way out. Just too many bourbon smashes. There'd been a lot of yelling and screaming and threats. I could see the handwriting on the wall and told my mother I was going to visit my father for the summer. I had spoken to my father maybe twice or thrice in the 4 years I'd been in New Orleans. I came back to find that he and my stepmother had produced a stepbrother and stepsister. Now there were 8 of us around the dinner table. The folks, 4 older kids, and 2 toddlers. My stepmother called me the prodigal son and let me know on a daily basis how she had suffered because my father had suffered due to my absence. She had not a kind word to say about my mother. With 8 people in the house, I was assigned a space in the basement. I used my maternal grandfather's military burial flag as a room divider. I slept on an actual straw mattress. It was hard and smelly. I started 7th grade in what was then called junior high in an Albany suburb. The senior high, where my father taught, was right across the parking lot. It was the 8th school in my educational career so far. Besides teaching, my father had leased some land and started a garden stand on the main drag in town. There was no office per se, just a couple of shade sheds. If it rained, you pretty much got wet. When I complained, my dad said, "Don't worry, you're not water soluble." He would bring in plant stock from New Jersey and sell it. We'd have roses in the spring, mums in the fall, plus a wide variety of flowering shrubs, evergreens, sapling trees, and other landscape material. We would line out plant material from cuttings for a year or two, dig them up, pot them, and sell them. I worked there during the summer and after school. The best part of living there were the dozens of neighborhood kids. We lived on a dead-end street. At the end of the street was a field we'd walk across to get to school. There were kids in about half the houses on my street, and more kids on the other side of the backyard fences. No matter what we did, whether it was playing hide and seek, playing football, baseball, we were always outside. I don't remember ever being inside any of my friends' houses. When I wasn't working in the summertime, we would ride our bikes to the reservoir to fish or swim. We'd go to the pool to dive. In the winter, we would skate in the creek that ran along the base of the street or go behind the school bus garage to the big rink. Nobody had money for hockey equipment. We wore figure skates mostly and played games like Capture the Flag and Burn the City. We spent all our time unsupervised and learned how to work as a group. We learned how to sort out our own problems without running off to get an adult. If we had a problem with a bully we couldn't handle, someone had a big brother that could. And we learned that sticks and stones can break our bones, but words can never hurt us. I tried to spend as much time in school as I could. I was always staying late for athletics, track in the spring, wrestling in the winter, and cross country in the fall. My father knew all the coaches and talked them into only having me practice 3 days a week instead of 5. He told them he needed me to work, which I did. On Saturdays and Sundays, he would get me around 6. We'd go to a local diner for breakfast, and then I would open up the stand around 8 o'clock. He'd lay out what my work was for the day. It consisted of waiting on customers, watering the stock, and weeding the lined-out material with a hoe. Then he'd get in his car and say he'd see me later. And he would see me later, like 6, 6:30, 7 in the evening. After starving the first couple times, I figured I was on my own for lunch. I would walk the half-mile back to the same diner I had breakfast in. The owner would feed me. He said he would run a tab that my father could pay. I don't think he ever told my father. If I'm sure my father would have mentioned it. We 4 older children ranged in age from 12 to 18. My father looked at us as free labor. I was the only boy, so I worked at the stand. At Christmas time, my father would have a number of Christmas tree stands on the same road. One at the aforementioned diner, one at the garden stand, and one a little further down the road at a mall. There was no shelter, no warmth, just waiting on customers out in the cold. My stepmother stayed home with the two young kids. The older kids all had to man the stands. Pulling a tree off the rack, bouncing it on the ground to knock the snow off it, and spinning it around for the customer on a freezing cold winter night is not as much fun as it sounds. Father would make his rounds to collect the money. He always looked so toasty as we handed him pockets full of cash. There was never any pay involved. If you wanted $1 to go see a movie, you'd hear all about how he was putting clothes on your back, food in your mouth, and a roof over your head. My father's marriage was dissolving. My stepmother would show me the bruises he left on her while telling me how I was growing more and more like him every day. Good times. Meanwhile, my mother had moved from New Orleans, made a brief stop in Texas, and wound up in San Pedro, California. Summer was coming, and I didn't fancy spending it all at the stand. I asked her if I could come out. She said sure. I broached the subject with my father. He said no. He needed me to work. I called my mother and told her everything was fine. Could she send me a ticket? She arranged to have one ready for pickup at the ticket counter. My flight was at 9 in the morning. The night before my flight, I couldn't sleep. I had decided to run away. I had packed a few things in a backpack. At 3 in the morning, I removed the basement window, pushed my backpack through the window, and followed it onto the driveway. I got my bike out of the garage and started the 8-mile ride to the airport. The airport was empty. This was long before modern airport security. At that time, you bought your ticket, walked to the gate, got on the plane. You could have kilos in your carry-on. Only a janitor was there. He asked what I was doing there. I was a small, almost 15-year-old. It was still dark out, and the airport was basically closed. I didn't think telling him I was running away from home was the way to go. So I said, well, my mom is homesick with my brothers and sisters, and my dad works graveyard at the plant. He had to drop me off on the way to work. That seemed to work. He didn't go to the phone. It was 6 in the morning. There were hours left before my flight. At that moment, my sister would be opening the basement door and yelling my name while listening for a response to make sure I was awake. I was sitting there imagining the scenario that would shortly ensue. I was wondering what action my father would take. Would he call the cops? Unlikely. Would he think to come to the airport? Maybe. I don't know how high anxiety is, but mine was pretty high. When the airplane landed in New York City and there were no cops to greet me, I figured I'd gotten away with it. In California, in 1965, surf was up. Freeways traveled at speed, and the shops had signs in their windows reading "Se habla español" to bring in the Hispanic trade. The British had invaded us again, this time with music. The counterculture had arrived with the age of Aquarius. Women were burning their bras, and men were burning their draft cards. Flower children lived on communes. The Beatles gave us long hair. You couldn't be a proper hippie without it. Bell-bottoms, platform shoes, a seashell necklace, and a fab shirt just weren't enough. LSD was on the scene. We were urged to turn on, tune in, and drop out. Sex, drugs, and rock and roll were the order of the day. Where do you think that phrase came from? It was ours, and we meant it. If a girl would say hello to you, there was a good chance she could sleep with you. It was called free love. A few days after my arrival at my mother's apartment in San Pedro, we called my father. He didn't believe that my mother was not complicit in my escape, but there wasn't much he could do about it. When my mother had been in Texas, she had met a man named Frank Donahue. Frank was a legendary waterman on the West Coast. He'd grown up on the beach in Santa Monica. He'd been a Santa Monica lifeguard. He was trained as a hard hat diver by the Navy and served on submarines in the Second World War. He'd earned 3 master's degrees. Before vitamin E was synthesized, it was extracted from shark liver. Frank would load his skiff with his wetsuit, mask, snorkel fins, a burlap bag, and chum. He'd off the coast of Santa Monica. About a mile out, he'd chum the waters around him. When the sharks started coming to investigate, he would don his gear, jump in the water, and start scooping them up with his bag. He had a nice crescent blue shark scar to prove it. At that time, he had a contract with the Port of Los Angeles wrapping pilings under the piers. My mother was his bookkeeper. Summer had just begun. My mother had to go to work, and she asked me if I'd like a job on the dive boat. I said sure. She took me to work one morning, and I met Frank on the boat. The boat was called the Roughneck. Frank asked me if I knew anything about boats. I said no. He asked me if I knew anything about seamanship, tying knots, steering a boat, compass. No. He asked me if I knew anything about engines. He asked me if I could dive. He finally asked me if I could cook. I responded no to all. He said, "Well, why should I hire you?" I'm glad it was a rhetorical question. I went to work as a diver's tender that summer. They're spirochetes, little worms that destroy the wooden pilings that support the docks. Our job was to wrap the pilings in a piece of plastic. Divers would seal the bottom by pouring concrete around the base. A plastic band held by titanium nails was put around the top. Sometimes that was my job. I'd work off a surfboard. This created a dead water area around the piling. No oxygen, no spirochetes. Usually I would change the air tanks to the divers as they needed them, throw them wraps, give them tools, or light cigarettes for them. That summer, Frank taught me to dive. Frank introduced me to two of his nephews, a couple brothers a few years older than me, Rick and Teddy. They lived right on Topanga Beach. Their house was on the sand. They were surfers and belonged to the Topanga Beach Bombers. The Bombers invited me to my first toga party. The California girls at the party were the ones that you hear songs about. In the fall, I went to San Pedro High and continued to work on the Roughneck after school. We had moved from Pacific up to Walker Street. I was riding my bike home one day when I was hit by a car. I flew head first right through the windshield. I woke up with my head on the front seat and my legs on the hood. I looked up at the white-haired lady driver and said, "I thought I'd just drop in." The doctor said the glass missed my jugular vein by less than 1/4 of an inch. It took 180 stitches to sew up my right forearm. This was my first brush with death. Many more would follow. At the end of that school year, Frank's job ended. We moved to Laurel Canyon and Hollywood. Movie stars abound. The Doors lived somewhere up behind us, and you could hear their practice bouncing off the canyon walls. My mother started a company. It was like a temp service. She would find people to do freelance advertising gigs. If you're an artist, a copywriter, a musician, or a photographer, my mother would find you work for a fee. I started school at Hollywood High. There were a group of boys that called themselves the Hollywood Argyles. They wore a black cloth coat with their nickname on the left breast. On the back was a capital A with lions rampant on either side. I was asked to join. After some insignificant hazing, I was in. They weren't bad boys at all. It was just a goofy social club, but the girls loved us. We'd load up a couple of Volkswagen Beetles and play hide and seek in the Hollywood Hills. I would ride with a 16-year-old who called himself Big Daddy. The headliner of his bug was papered with blue traffic citations. Playing hide and seek at high speed on those curvy hairpin roads was a wild ride, and we're lucky to have survived it. Our president was a black kid, the only black kid in the Argyles. He went by the name Lord Jim. I never got the whole story on Jim, but I think he was an orphan. He lived at the YMCA, and that's where the Argyles met once a week. He owned a 1952 Jaguar Mark VII. We cruised Hollywood Boulevard and the Sunset Strip mostly, but if you were riding with Jim, you were going to cruise Fountain Street. By the time I was 17, things weren't working out for me at school. I tried 10th grade a couple of times, but I just wasn't getting the hang of it. I'd always been an avid reader. and I would read things that interested me while I was supposed to be doing my homework. I read history, Tarzan, Sherlock Holmes, the classics, and science fiction. I was just bored with school. My mother's best advice was, "Son, if you're not in bed by 10 o'clock, come home." Did I mention free love? One day, I walked by the Army recruiting office on Hollywood Boulevard. In the window was a brochure about the airborne. There was a picture of a paratrooper exiting an aircraft. At 17, I wasn't old enough to enlist. The Hollywood recruiter, Sergeant Aloysius Goodman, had to come to my house and ask my mommy for permission for me to be used as cannon fodder. She signed on the line. She had always been very anti-war, and I never thought she would. 30 years later, I asked her why she signed. She said, "Jesse, you always land on your feet." She wasn't wrong. So far, I always have. But at that time, as well as her freelance business, she'd written a book. It turned into be a blockbuster. She appeared on all the late-night shows. Johnny Carson, Dick Cavett, all of them wanted her. The book was catching fire in Europe as well. Her agent was talking about a European tour. So me staying with my Uncle Sam for 3 years made perfect sense. Dear listener, if you have enjoyed this episode, please share it. A 5-star review on Spotify or wherever you listen would be greatly appreciated. You can follow me and my Mastiff, Drax the Destroyer, on the It's in the Blood Facebook page. Or you can send me an email at jesse.it'sintheblood@gmail.com. Thank you so much for your support.